I think one of the challenges would be if you have parallel production lines, you would also have to have more staff, right, that operates these production lines.
And space.
Space, yeah.
Those are all challenges, yeah.
Yeah,
Zoltán, you bring up a good point. And there were some audience questions to that effect too. So let's kind of run down that rabbit hole for a minute. We had a question come in the registration phase about this exactly. The question was, what equipment, facilities, personnel expertise is needed to ramp up a facility quickly? Obviously, we can get into that, but the quick of the question is this part of the equation always governmental, which I think we saw a lot of that obviously during COVID, like the government stepped in and paid, right? Like they footed large swaths of the bill. So the question is that part of the equation always governmental, or is there any reason for a private industry to be working on problems before they emerge, to be setting up, perhaps on their own dime, or, in addition to government funding, working on solutions prior to the emergence of the problem? We had another one come up just a minute ago, another question from the audience from Jim. No, I'm sorry, it was from Dale. How does BARDA play into this and the availability of the military to supplement workforce needed to reach needed capacity? Can we do it again? So I guess these questions kind of balled up. They beg the question, how much reliance should private enterprise, companies like TFF, companies like those that Wellcome R3 is looking to serve, how much should they take on themselves versus rely on emergency funding from government agencies? I throw that one out there to Kayla. Let's start with you. I mean, do you have thoughts on that? Like, I do
a little bit. I think when we're looking at in terms of TFF, we're looking at putting things in a modular space that can be moved around for sure. Like before, our bench scale or early stage product development was very bench top. It was hard to move in or out. We work with a lot of CMOs, which I think plays a big part in scaling up, worldwide as well. We'll get into that later, but I think, definitely being mobile is a huge benefit, being able to roll it in, plug it in, use it, and connect, utilities that are ready to go for it plays a big role in being able to be flexible for demands. And then I think, that scale size is where it gets tricky, right? How much, if you're working at a lower volume of a bigger tank, then scaling up to that is, not a huge investment, but then it kind of goes into buying a bunch of backup equipment that potentially isn't used, or like we were talking about, all these trains that you don't use later on. If they're all scaled too big, that's where, government money and funding might be more needed or required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I need to interrupt the conversation super briefly and get a poll question underway here. This question is for our audience, not for you, Zoltán and Kayla, although you're welcome to weigh in. The question is, which of the following scenarios would justify the need for a surge manufacturing strategy in your company? Your options are another global pandemic, biopharma raw material supply chain shortages, natural disasters, biopharma product drug recalls, manufacturing plant emergency closures. None of the above. We already have and implement our own surge manufacturing strategy playbook. All of the above or other. And if your response is other, feel free to throw the other in the chat box so we're aware of that. But take a minute to answer that question. Zoltán, I'd ask you just to reflect on that for a quick minute. Like, we're talking largely in the context of the pandemic that we just sort of came out of, and preparation for that to, happening again, or something like it happening again. Do you, Zoltán, can you think of a scenario like any of those mentioned in this polling question that might be more likely than others to require the surge manufacturing capacity, emergency manufacturing capacity?
Interesting one. So I think probably another infectious disease could be a reason for using surge manufacturing capacity, and there are certain studies indicating that pandemics might become more frequent now, more frequent than once in 100 years, maybe once every couple of decades or so, we'll have some kind of an outbreak that would have pandemic potential, right? So, and that's because everything is more globalized now. Population is increased, and there's just more livestock around, right? So all of that could just, there's more potential, more chance, just randomly that something will just evolve and spread more quickly.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think in terms of maybe going back to the previous question, if I may, on the surge manufacturing, like how would that play out, and whether the government would fund it or private organizations would have to fund it. Probably in my head, it might make sense to have a kind of like a private-public partnership for this, right?
Yeah.
And potentially one way of doing that would be to have, at some point when we have multiple RNA vaccines, each of these, or even therapeutics, each of the facilities that make these could be scaled to a larger scale than what the demand for that product is. Maybe like 20-30% larger scale, so an excessive scale there, and then use that excess scale to make outbreak response products when there's an outbreak, right?
Yeah.
But then when there's no outbreak, then you have to finance that somehow, because that comes at a cost, right? That excess capacity, right? But something like that a model like that could potentially, at least in my head, work to have some capacity ready for that can be readily deployed when there's a need for it, right?
You paused when you said something about financing excess capacity. I was waiting for your brilliant response as to how we would finance that excess capacity.
That might be maybe public funding. Governments might want that as almost like as they would fund other services, like they fund firefighters, the army, and so on. And most of the time they're not used,
And in that scenario, I can envision that sort of proactive approach to financing that excess capacity, costing the government considerably less, in fact, than it probably spent responding to COVID.
Yeah,
is that feasible?
Almost, yes.
Yeah. Let's take a look at those poll results. See if they line up with another global pandemic. Yeah, I think that aligns, Zoltán, with what you were saying, right? That looks like that was our leading response. Yeah. I want to jump into a couple more audience questions, and then we'll get into some of the cost, capacity, logistics, and regulatory challenges, because I think they're all related. There have been a couple questions here about workforce and the challenge of. I like the way that Sonia phrased this. I imagine equipment operators are specialized. How do you surge people? She says it makes sense for everything you're saying when you're talking about equipment, but how do you ramp up the people responsible for the use of the equipment? There was that earlier question about do we leverage federal personnel, and then another question from Jay that asks in a related fashion if automation will help make that workforce issue less critical, less reliance on volumes of people, which we all know there's a shortage of in biopharma right now, talent and manufacturing skill. So thoughts on that, Kayla? I'll start with you. What are your thoughts? Maybe lean into some experiences, at Moderna. Like, was it just did the place become a beehive? I mean, was it just a hiring spree? Was it heavily dependent on people?
I'd say originally it was the quickest increase is definitely consultants, right? Bring people in to help start equipment up. There's literally divisions of people to help with CQB and bring equipment on. So I think that was kind of a people aspect for sure. Operators definitely had to increase from one shift to multiple, right? We weren't really running around the clock all the time before, but that definitely was a quick increase. Luckily, as you're qualifying equipment and testing it, you can start to bring on those operators and train them before there's even product going through. So there's a lot of different, benefits there.